Welcome to this second of our every other month speaker series here in Hollywood, sponsored by the Historical Commission. We'd like to recognize Rob Abendoni Daly, our mayor, and Dan Gibbons from the City Council, and welcome all of you to this special evening with Alan. I was pleased to hear Alan a month ago or so in Emery Grove, right? And Alan's I got a call a few days ago. He's been scoping the neighborhoods, I think, and preparing. So we appreciate your preparation. And I'm going to turn the time to Kim Duffy from the Historical Commission to give an introduction.
Hi, yes, I'm Kim Duffy with the Holiday Historical Commission, and we're happy to have Alan as our speaker tonight. He's not really, it's kind of a coup that we have him because he's not really taking these invitations anymore because he's finishing 2 books right now. I met Alan 35 years ago when a group of us were trying to stop the Hotel Utah from becoming an office building, and we saw how that went. He had already been on the state architectural, he had been the state architectural historian and preservation architect and co-founded Cooper Roberts Architects. Between writing 10 books and countless articles over the next decades, he managed to drive to every single Utah town, looking at, documenting, and understanding the historic buildings and the people who made them. And in the process, he has saved a lot of those beautiful buildings. So let's hear what he found in Holiday.
I think in these times especially, it's helpful for people to better understand one another. And I know a few of you in the audience, but not most of you. So to enable me to better understand you, I'd like to ask you a few questions which you can answer by the raising of hands. And there's no trick questions. They all have serious intent. How many of you own or live in an historic home? And the definition by virtue of the National Register of Historic Home would be one that is at least 50 years old and architecturally intact and has some kind of historical significance. So how many? Okay, quite a few. How many of you are concerned over the recent trend to destroy buildings and replace them with new buildings in Holiday? The same people, a few more. How many would like to see an increase in preservation activity in Holiday? Even a few more. The mayor and his wife are not raising their hands. I appreciate that you're here tonight listening to some esoterica instead of watching the Major League Baseball home run, all-star home run event that's going on at the same time. So, and this also is not a trick question. How many of you who enjoy traveling would be less likely to visit cities like Rome, Paris, Athens, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, and the like, if all of the historic buildings in those cities were removed? Less likely. Okay. Less likely, yeah. So I think I understand you better. Quite a few of you are lovers of history and of your historic homes and historic environments in the city. So I'd like to better explain myself to you. I usually speak from notes and ad lib a lot, but to be more specific and accurate and focused and content rich, I've actually written some of this out. So I'm going to read this. I've spent the last half century of my life as a passionate advocate for and professional practitioner of historic preservation. This career-long commitment to preservation had its genesis in my early love of architecture, art, and history. Thus, my definition of historic preservation is as broad and inclusive as possible. To be sure, it includes building preservation, which is my focus for this evening, but it also includes all cultural expressions from the past, from the fine arts and performing arts to literature and to the physical remnants that document the human past, archaeological and historic sites and landscapes, folk studies, historic structures and artifacts of all sorts, and history itself, whether conveyed through photos, oral tradition, or through the written word or spoken word. I'm proud to have authored scores of books, articles, and historical studies, and have given many presentations on Utah's cultural history. As an architect and preservationist, and as a building owner and historic building developer, I'm glad to have helped save and restore and beneficially reuse hundreds of historic buildings in Utah and really outside of Utah. Moreover, as an architectural historian, I'm happy to have helped place literally thousands of individual buildings and buildings within several historic districts on the National Register of Historic Places, providing a means for others to learn about our heritage through these structures, while enabling others as well to take advantage of preservation incentives to restore and reuse these buildings. So my intent tonight is to draw upon this experience, including my working career at the State Historical Society, a private consulting group called History Projects, and CRS Architects, to talk about preservation successes and then outline an ideal or model preservation plan that could be adopted here in Holiday. So to provide some useful context, I'd like to show you some slides that illustrate some of the city's historic buildings past and gone, as well as present and still with us. Holiday's had an interesting and somewhat atypical history. The founding group was primarily from the South, southern states, the Mississippi Company, and 24 men and their families came, and they were joined by members of the Mormon Battalion who had just arrived in Utah from California, and then another group that was part of the settling group was from Nauvoo itself and came across the plains. They arrived, this composite group arrived in Utah in July 29th, 1847, just 5 days after the vanguard party of pioneers arrived. And immediately they started looking at the eastern part of the valley and discovered Spring Creek and started settling there. They were nonconformists in a way. Brigham Young wanted them to come into the log fort in Salt Lake, but instead they stayed out by Spring Creek. And in 1858, when the move occurred, when all of the cities north of Provo were abandoned and everybody had to move to Provo and south because of Johnson's army, a number of the settlers of Spring Creek, which was named Holiday after founder John Holiday, they chose to stay instead of moving. And so Holiday has the honor of being the second settlement in Utah. Bountiful likes to claim that. Provo and Ogden and others, they all want to say they're the second settlement, but really it was just days after the initial settlement that Spring Creek began to be colonized. There are a lot of famous people in that early settlement group. If I were to name that group, you would recognize almost all of the names. And there are people like Milo Andrus. He and his sons had many houses here. He was a high-level church leader. He was sort of a poster child for polygamy. He had 11 wives and 57 children, one more than Brigham Young. And William Bringhurst was among the early settlers. He was a builder, helped settle Springville and a number of other towns. David Brinton became a large presence here in Holiday, and his house is still extant. Solomon Chase was an architect and builder in a number of towns throughout Utah. Lauren Farr was part of the original settlement group, and he was the mayor of Ogden and a very high-level church leader in that part of Utah. John D. Lee, who was Brigham Young's adopted son and the only person executed for the Mormon Mountain Meadows Massacre. Say that quickly 3 times. And I could go on, and I have the names of many others. And if these names no longer exist here in town, it's because this location, Holiday, was the launching pad for a lot of persons who became the founders of settlements all through the Mormon corridor, from Canada to Mexico, like California, Utah, Idaho, etc., Nevada. Many of the other 400 to 500 settlements established during Brigham Young's 30-year period here were settled by people who started out in Holiday. So let's look at some slides, and hopefully we can. We can't. It has to warm up, I'm told. And you're the warmer-upper. By the way, the original plat of Holiday, which I'll show you a picture of, was 181 acres. And now Holiday has 8 square miles, a little different. And it now has a population of about 31,000, if my numbers are correct. So, this was the first plat. Yeah, you can turn off the lights. I think I can probably read this without the lights. That is not a typical Mormon town plat. Again, nonconformists. All of the lots are straddling Spring Creek. They're all different shapes and angles. The typical Utah town was platted after the Joseph Smith's 1833 plan for the city of Zion, with a strict grid, north, south, east, west streets like Salt Lake and just about any other town in Utah. This was a very different way to approach Mormon town planning. Here is a map showing early settlers of what was called Cottonwood. There have been many names: Spring Creek, Cottonwood, Big Cottonwood, Holiday, and even some others. And you can see the main streets at the time that this was created. And I drove around this area during the week, and I found that virtually all of these buildings, all of these homes, churches, schools, industrial buildings, commercial buildings, flour mills, pretty much everything no longer exists. Here's a photo, aerial photo, and again you can see the lack of a grid, and the contours of the earth might have had something to do with it, where the creek was, better land. I don't know what was driving the departure from the standard gridded Mormon city plan, but Holiday did that. You can see it here too on a contemporary map. It's more like somebody dropped a bucket of worms, traced them, and those became the streets. Or maybe it's not that bad, but not a grid. So buildings, Cottonwood, aka Holiday, was similar to other Mormon villages. They initially had no technology to build elaborate buildings, so we have log cabins. This existed here, and as we might expect, these buildings are long gone. Fairly early on, adobe buildings were built. Brigham Young was a big fan of adobe. He thought the pyramids of Egypt were built out of adobe. He said that in a lecture. He said that if you build 3 buildings, one of limestone, one of sandstone, one of adobe, the adobe one would outlast the stone ones. That didn't happen to be the case. He even wanted the Salt Lake Temple to be built of adobe on sandstone foundation. And he was talked out of it, and it's a good thing, because otherwise we would have had the world's largest Gothic revival mud pile. But anyway, and you can see the wood frame construction after sawmills came into place, which was very early, next to the Adobe building. All of these buildings were in Holiday. This was one of Milo Andrus's houses, and I think it was torn down recently. And he might have been the most important permanent member of the community during the early decades. Kim? No, I know.
Holiday Boulevard, where Cottonwood intersect Holiday Boulevard.
There's a vacant lot there now, but some of his son's houses are still standing next door. Oh, okay. This is the Hinsey house, which, this is an old photo. Notice the nice little brackets. And miraculously, this house, which dates from the late 1860s, is still standing. Here's another home. This is a hall parlor floor plan with an addition in the back. Notice the fretwork and grillwork and the lathe turned posts. And that house is still standing across from Kim's house, actually on Walker. We know the Castile house was moved and restored. I was involved in this actually. And it's a nice job. It was done well. And it's unfortunate that the building is not used. You can see the door is boarded up. It'd be great if some public use could be found for it. It's not a great precedent for preservation to do a project like this and then have it essentially not be used. I understand there's some talk about doing a museum, history museum, and maybe this could be a house museum like the one in Centerville. There's one in Bountiful. There's several of them throughout the state where the houses become little museums. There were now the next generation, 1860s, we start getting into stone and more adobe construction. We start getting two-story homes. This one is gone. This is called the Central Passage I-form style of Mormon house type. But this one, which is a little bit later with the curved arched windows from probably around 1880, is one of the very, very few still existing in the area. This house in Holiday was called the Castle, and I'd like to know more about it, but it is gone. We have a number of Italianate cottages, Victorian cottages that were built in the 1880s and into the 90s. This one is gone, but this one is still there. And it's really well preserved, well maintained, lovingly, manicured in terms of the landscaping. It's a really nice preservation example.
That's Spring Lane.
There were others of these Italianate houses with hip roofs, recessed porches, segmented arched windows, and they are for the most part gone, but here's one that's still here. So you're starting to see a pattern that a lot of things are gone, but we have like one example of each style still remaining. And some of these are on the register. Here's another Victorian period house that is no longer with us. But we have a couple of turn of the century, 1890s, 1905 houses that are still extant and in good condition. Then we get into the 20th century, and we have a lot of bungalows throughout the state, thousands of them. And they're all different styles of bungalows, and there are some in Holiday. This is a Cotswold-style bungalow with clipped gable roofs and the broad side to the street. Another one. That's Kim's house. This is a period revival house. After World War I, the Doughboys came home. They loved the architecture of provincial France and England and other European places, and so they wanted houses that had that European feel. And so between World War I and II, there were a number of these period houses of different European styles. Here's a little tiny Tudor house and some much larger ones. So these styles were imported and brought here from other places. These are, some are here, some are gone. And now we get into the early modern period. This is an Art Moderne house, circa probably late 30s, early 40s. Fairly rare. And then we get the mid-century modern houses from the 50s and 60s. And David Emmett is here, and he helped create a historic district of about 12 of these houses here in the city, the only historic district you have. I'm going to go faster. All of the commercial buildings from the historic periods are gone. I'm just going to show some of them. Some of them were substantial and architecturally significant, and they are gone. The flour mill, Knutson's flour mill, which was a key building to provide flour and food for the early pioneers, that complex of buildings is gone. The early schools, church schools, the buildings like this were used for multiple purposes: social halls, city halls, school, church, recreation, all of those uses in one single building. This is gone. Another school, all of these in Holiday have been lost. This one too, 2 stories now with the belfry. And there were 2 buildings sort of like this one, again, gone. And then religious architecture. The early meeting houses, log, adobe, were replaced by others of stone and brick. This is one of them, the one on the right. And then this is, I think, the early 20th century Gothic building, Holiday Meeting House being constructed. And added to that later was this 1920s Prairie style addition, which is a style developed by Frank Lloyd Wright. All of these church buildings are gone. Here's one that's still here, early modern church. And then Cobblecrest. This was the popular hangout, dancing and recreating, and probably the most popular place in the east part of the valley. And we've lost that one too.
Alan,
Yes.
I have a question about that. The Cobblecrest, there's a home on that corner
Yeah.
with a cobble rock foundation around it. I'm just wondering if the foundation is pretty fun. I don't know that.
I do not know that. I think it might even be in Cottonwood Heights. I'm not sure.
It's on 61 South Street.
Yeah, okay. I know that parts of Holiday have been carved out for other places, and you've annexed other places, so you've gone from 5 square miles to 8, even though earlier some pieces were lost to maybe Midvale and Cottonwood Heights. So I'm going to save the comments on this slide for later.
What's referred to as the old mill, is that part of Holiday?
That's in Cottonwood Heights. That was actually the Deseret Paper Mill. It was built in 1881 and designed by Henry Grow, who was the engineer for the Salt Lake Tabernacle. Very significant building. It's too bad it's in ruins. It burned. It's been used as a spook house and many other things over the years. I'd love to see a preservation developer take that project on and get tax credits and so forth. I worry that that property is so valuable that building may disappear.
Does this just Cottonwood Heights City own it right now?
No, I think it's owned by Walkers.
So it's private.
Yes. Yeah. Given these, so Holiday evolved in a series of periods. We tend to focus on the pioneer period, but there were other periods that came after that. And there are 2 books, these 2 books, and 2 other books that are small books, but they have good detail about the history of Cottonwood / Holiday. And some of these pictures came from these books. and they discuss the different periods. I'm just going to quickly mention them. The pioneer period from 1847 to 75. These came from the authors of these books. Development period 1876 to 1909. Years of progress 1910 to 1950. And expansion period 1950 to the present. I would probably divide these differently, taking into account world wars, the Great Depression, the coming of the railroad, the death of Brigham Young, and other important things. But you can see that one goal of preservation here would be to find and document and create preservation strategies for keeping the buildings that represent each of these periods that I showed you, each of these architectural styles, each of these periods of Holliday's history.
Are there funds available to help do that?
I'm going to talk about that. I'm just going to skip over some of this because of time, and so there can be Q&A, and then you can ask us questions. So I understand that there is some concern on the part of city officials that a preservation policy or program might result in limiting property rights, and this concern comes from the Cottonwood Mall property turmoil that's been going on for many, many years. And so I want to address the fact that in the state of Utah, many, many cities have preservation plans and policies that embrace all kinds of techniques, strategies, fundraising for preserving the historic building stock. And the question would be, why, when those cities have similar concerns about property rights, have they overcome those concerns, transcended them in a sense, and created these preservation programs? So I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about the benefits of historic preservation programs. I'm going to do this in three categories. The first one is that preservation supports and enhances historical and cultural values. So these include community identity and continuity, community pride. In the east we have Mount Vernon, Monticello, Independence Hall, Williamsburg. Sites like that in Utah, we've got Temple Square, the Lion and Beehive houses, the city and county building, the territorial and state capitals, and many others. So each city in Utah has character-defining buildings that they have preserved. The question is, in Holiday, what are those sites? And if they don't have that status now, could they have? There is value in the local history of events, individuals, and community evolution through historical education, stories, and lessons. Architectural beauty and visual character is another advantage of historic preservation. I've been reading some architectural neuroscience studies recently that show that high-quality buildings with natural light, ceiling height, good colors, good design have a positive effect on the human psyche and human performance, whereas slums, concrete jungles, dehumanizing buildings have the opposite effect. They are very harmful to humans. The second category is financial viability, economic value. The towns and cities that preserve their historic buildings benefit from what we call heritage tourism. Salt Lake's a good example. Something like 3 to 4 million people a year go visit there. And heritage tourism is a big source of income in places like St. George, Springdale, Spring City, Midway, and I could name a lot of other Utah cities. And so that is one benefit of historic buildings. Historic buildings are eligible for federal tax credits, 20% federal tax credit for income-producing restored buildings, and a state tax credit of 20% for residential buildings. So I have done projects, for example, for a firm called Pingree and Dally. They buy old schools and old hotels, and they use tax credits along with facade easements to reduce the cost of their projects by 40 to 50%. This is a great financial advantage for restoring buildings. Facade easements have a value, and preservation easements as well. Those are received by the Preservation Utah group, and you can have an appraiser evaluate the loss of development rights, that value compared to the current use value, take a percentage, and you can use it as a deduction. The building code, the IBC, allows building officials to use leniency and waivers on historic building renovation projects to protect architectural integrity. That's another advantage. There are many organizations that have grant programs that can be applied to, and I have a list of them which I won't read. And there are many government agencies, both federal and state, that support preservation projects. SBA, HUD, EDA, FHA, CDBG, federal, and then the state, UDOT, the Community Impact Board, redevelopment agencies, and others that do historic preservation projects, and those can be applied for if you have projects here. The third category of benefit is that preservation is environmentally responsible. In the land of LEED and Energy Star and other programs that encourage and reward sustainability, historic buildings rate the highest. That is to say, restoring an existing building is more green and sustainable than new construction. It's the ultimate in recycling. Renovation is less toxic and less polluting than new construction, and it's labor intensive. Renovation is also less expensive. Now you may say, no, it's not. Renovation is more expensive than new construction, but think about it. If you have an existing building, you already have the land, the infrastructure, the excavation, the footing and foundation system, the walls, the floors, the structure. All of that is in place, and that equals about 20% of the value of a new building. So even if you do new mechanical, electrical, structural, new finishes, energy conserving features, even if you do all of that to an existing building, it's still less expensive to renovate a building versus creating new construction. And new construction is by far more polluting and toxic. Renovation issues like seismic, asbestos, lead-based paint, ADA access, energy use, all of these are solvable with historic building renovation, as evident by the many projects completed every year. In fact, in a typical year, 75% of the building permits that are pulled in most places are for building renovation or remodeling. And of course, the building codes address historic buildings as well, and give incentives to handle sensitive issues with safety. I'd like to now outline and detail the components of a model preservation plan. And there are many precedents for this, and I will reference some of those as I go by. The first is to contract with a historic building surveyor, and the State Historical Society has lists of these people, and I've been one on and off for many years, to do a reconnaissance survey. This is a windshield survey. Basically, the person goes up and down every street with a computer program with an information data sheet, and they fill out information about each building. That is, each building that's over 50 years old. And that creates a database that allows you to understand the breadth and depth of your resources. As I drove around the other day, I noticed several very interesting historic buildings that neither Kim nor the books, nobody has mentioned. Pioneer buildings even, hidden away. and somebody else referenced that earlier, and they're not known. They haven't been found, and the reconnaissance survey does that. I have a list of the research sources, and I'm not going to go over that list, but I can leave this paper with Kim. The next thing is to focus on the most significant buildings, and the way to do that is by what the state calls intensive level surveys. These are more in depth. You take an individual building, go to the courthouse, find out who the owners were, research the owners, their significance, the style of the building. And the third step after that generally leads to listing on the National Register or a local register. And I understand you do have a local register that is not fully activated. Then things that go along with the National Register, there are many kinds of nominations. There are individual buildings, like we saw on the slide, historic districts, where you have several buildings that are in the same location as per the Lakewood district that David worked on. You have thematic nominations, like, say, all of the buildings done by a particular architect, or all of the brick Victorian buildings in a certain area. And so there are different ways to acknowledge and honor buildings of significance. There is no downside to being on a historical register unless there is a preservation ordinance that has design guidelines to be complied with, or demolition ordinances to deal with. But listing by itself has no negative effect, and in fact it has a number of positive ones. The fourth thing is to provide preservation education. I have a whole list of things you can do. You've already done some of them: walking tours, brochures, markers, articles, school curriculum, annual house tours. There's a whole lot of ways that you can raise the awareness level of people about preservation. I suggest that the Holiday CLG, which stands for Certified Local Government, which is a program of the State Historical Society, that is activated, and that it takes advantage of the state's CLG programs like consulting services and grants that could be used, for example, to do the reconnaissance survey. And then the important thing after these steps would be to create a Holiday Historic Landmarks Commission. And the composition would be an odd number of people, usually 3 to 9, with representatives such as architects and architectural historians, contractors, archaeologists, real estate appraisers, land use attorneys, and so forth, as well as representatives from each of the historic districts. That's how most of the other commissions are formed. And then the next step is to adopt a preservation ordinance. And you can get samples of these from other cities and from the State Historical Society and the CLG program. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can gather up half a dozen of them, have a committee that reviews them, extract the ideas that you like, that would work, that would be supported by government and by people, and leave out the other elements. But most of them have the following things. You have a process for designating historic sites. You have design guidelines for work done on new buildings in historic districts or for individually listed buildings that are renovated. You have a demolition and economic hardship provision. You have renovation applications so that a person can get a certificate of appropriateness when the project's done. And those are the kinds of things that you find in such an ordinance. And again, I would say that in Utah, dozens, if not scores, of cities and towns have these ordinances because they find them valuable for achieving city planning purposes. The next thing would be to hold regular Historic Landmarks Commission meetings, have a staff member appointed as a planning HLC coordinator or liaison. Then you have agendas, you review applications, you administrate the ordinance, and you work with the local building official on issues that are pertinent to building renovation. I think another thing would be for this new commission to work with the Historical Commission and with the CLG group so that all three groups are on the same page, applying for funding to raise money to support preservation, adding more buildings to the register, creating educational programs, and celebrating holidays past. I'm going to leave out some other details here and just conclude by talking about some success stories where these approaches have been used. Salt Lake has a strong preservation ordinance, and their population is, 200,000, yours is 31,000. But this map, the reason I have that is because it shows two types of historic districts. The yellow ones are National Register districts, and the kind of blue-gray ones are city register districts, and some districts are both. So they have 25 historic districts, and in those districts are thousands, many thousands of buildings. In addition, they have 300 individually registered buildings. The amount of area you can see is about a third or 40%, maybe more, of the early city plats. These districts take up lots of the city. In fact, about 500 city blocks are on historical registers. So they get all of the advantages, economic and other benefits that I listed earlier. And as a result, their commission, they have a landmarks ordinance, they have all the things I mentioned. They have saved many buildings, and many of these buildings have gotten tax credits and facade easements and other incentives for economic benefit. Provo has the same historic districts, historic commission, individual sites, ordinances. They have saved many buildings in this manner, including the old BY Academy, which became their city library, the Mazer School, which was converted into senior housing, Provo Town Square, which is a group of commercial buildings from the Victorian period. These projects were made possible and enhanced because of the preservation program. Ogden, same thing. They have the same components. And what they have saved there is their beautiful, tall city hall, Ogden High School, the American Can Factory, and all of Lower 25th Street. Again, a partnership between the city, Father's Preservation Plan, and local developers or public entities. Park City, the same thing. And they have preserved their Main Street and their residential miners' cabins historic district with about 400 buildings in it. They have a grant program that I'm going to mention later. In fact, I think I'll mention it now. You might say, well, how is it possible these cities have these things, we don't? It has to do with civic will, leadership will, citizen will. You need to be activists. I'm not advocating rebellion or overthrowing. I'm advocating that if you believe in something, you support it. If you want something that's valuable to you, you have to organize with others and plan to get it. So I was on the Historic District Commission as chairman in Park City when the city received a community development block grant for a $2 million parking structure, the China Bridge parking structure. Well, they thought that was necessary at the time, but the Preservation Commission felt that it was more important to use that money to create two grant programs, one for Main Street and one for the residential district. And so we, citizenry agreed, and the city changed its mind. They took the money from one project and they put it over into the grant project. So what was the result of that? Most of the buildings on Main Street were restored, and there was a 12-to-1 leveraging ratio. That is, for every grant dollar that was received, $12 were spent by the owners of these buildings to restore their buildings. So it was a great leverage. And the same thing was done in the residential historic district. So that change in policy, that redirection of money was so successful that that program was renewed every year for several years. And eventually the parking structure was built, and so the city got everything it wanted, just not in the same order. I have a conclusion, but I think I'm going to leave it. It's long, and I think I'm going to instead go to questions and answers, because I've got about a 4-page conclusion. And
Alan?
yeah,
Question.
yeah.
If you were to, with your view of Holiday, if you were to identify a district, obviously this is I grew up on Harvard Yale, so
And that's a great district. Every house is significant.
Lots of homes all up and down the street.
Yeah.
To identify a district of Holiday where it would be a good candidate for either a historic or local district that you're talking about, where would that be?
Well, I think maybe the best person to answer that would be either Kim or David, or maybe one of you who lives here. But a district, generally, over 50% of the buildings have to comply with the theme of the district. So if it's mid-century modern houses, like the Lakewood district, I think those 12 houses are right in a row, right? They're pretty much all together without any exceptions or intrusions. Is that right? Something close to that. So I think it would be 20th century, maybe a bungalow district, because you have quite a few of those. You don't have a concentration of pioneer buildings anymore. You've just got scattered ones, so they get nominated individually. David.
I know the National Register does have a category by which you can group buildings that are not together, but share similar.
It's called the thematic nomination, yeah. Like the bridges of Madison County. They're all over the county, but they're all bridges, and they're all similar, but that's what you're talking about. So that could be done.
Murray has their thematic bungalows collection.
Yeah.
Holiday has a really high concentration of stockbroker tutors that I think would be, a great thematic type of district.
Right.
Even though they're not all together.
Right. That's a good question. So, other questions? Kim?
Could you talk to, once someone has their house on the National Register, can you explain to people how that does not interfere with your property rights? I mean, our house is on the National Register, and if we decided to tear it down next month, we have every right to do that.
That's correct.
Explain a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mentioned it, that being on the register, either national, state, which doesn't exist anymore, or city, there are many city registers, and you have a small one. And there are only about 10 to 12 buildings, all of Holiday, that are on a register. That really surprised me. Because Sandy and, name all of the surrounding towns, they have dozens and scores, and in Salt Lake's case, several thousands of buildings on the register. Being on the register in and of itself has no negative consequences. The federal government lists, it's just a list. It's a list of significant buildings. And it's nothing more than that. However, if you have an ordinance, like Salt Lake, they have design guidelines. So if you own a Victorian house in the avenues and you want to build an addition, there are guidelines for how to do that compatibly so you don't compromise the architectural integrity of the original building. That actually is a benefit to the people to have those guidelines so they don't build some concrete block, flat-roofed addition on the side of a 2.5-story East Lake Victorian. But also, the most controversial thing of all of this is the demolition, or it's really anti-demolition component of all of these guidelines. In Salt Lake, if you have a building on the register, you can't just go demolish it. You have to get permission. And if you're a contributory building that is not individually listed, but let's say you had there are several neighborhoods of just streetscapes of bungalows intact, 12 in a row, street after street. If you have one of those, you can't just demolish your house. You have to apply to do it. And there's a criteria that you have to follow to be able to do it. And if you're denied, then there's an appeal process, and there's also something called economic hardship. If you can document through an appraiser or contractor, someone like that, that it's economically infeasible to continue to keep that building, then there are exceptions where you're allowed to do the demolition anyway. But the only limitation to being on a register is if you have an ordinance that overlays, that has your house in it, included within it. Yes?
Maybe by way of comment or question, I am an HOA refugee from Rolling Hills HOA in Southern California. We bought a little home that I was kind of oblivious to the HOA guidelines and regulations.
Yeah.
We painted it blue, and my neighbors, I feel like, took an unwholesome interest in our blue wall, you know, and I was ordered to paint the wall white, and this is, we put in block windows under cover, glass block windows under cover of darkness, you know. And I said, when we moved to Holiday, I said, we can do what we want, you know, I mean, and we bought kind of one of the homes that was pictured that kind of had a California mid-century. I said, we can do what we want here, and but it's in the Lakewood district, and I just, again, this is by way of comment, that it feels like a wholesome interest in our home, and not an intrusive or sort of. We'll see how it plays out, but I think I have the same reaction to an ordinance that sort of over-regulated my vision of that property, that the national designation doesn't do.
No, I own a condo, and I'm the chairman of our HOA. And HOA's guidelines can be very onerous and really restrictive or prescriptive. They can force you to do stuff. They can restrict you from doing stuff. And I understand what you're saying. So the design guidelines are intended to strengthen the historical and visual character of a building. It doesn't mean that you have to exactly replicate it like in a museum kind of, accuracy. This federal guideline is called, to get the tax credits, you have to comply with a little brochure. It's called the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation, and it's a do and don't kind of two-column comparison thing. But it's rehabilitation. It doesn't say restoration. It's, we're not trying to recreate Independence Hall exactly brick by brick after it burned down or something like that. So, yes.
So where's the Lakewood district?
David.
Arrow, off of 5600 South Arrow Drive and Lone Peak Drive. Just west of the Cotton Club.
So you know blue wall.
You had a question, yes.
Do you think putting your home on the National Register is a good first step, as far as if there's not an ordinance that's really in place in Holiday, as far as if you care about your home and kind of gaining or recording some history on it? Do you think that's a good kind of first step, just to have it recorded? And then I feel like if I were buying a home that was on the National Register, even if you're able to tear it down, it would make me kind of read through and be aware of the history and take a pause on, is this something that I want to buy and kind of continue on with that legacy, or, I feel like that would intrigue me and at least help, even though it wouldn't keep me from tearing down the home or buying it. It seems like as a buyer, it would at least give me some knowledge on what it is that I need.
I would say yes, definitely. You can do it on your own. It doesn't take anybody's permission. You can do your own research. You don't have to hire somebody to do it. It's a simple form. History, architecture, condition, photos. You submit it to a committee. That's Utah Historical Society. I used to do all the nominations for the state, So yeah, and real estate appraisers have done studies that show buildings on the National Register are more valuable when they resell. And so there's that too. Just as buildings designed by architects tend to be more valuable than ones designed on the back of a paper bag by a contractor in his pickup truck. So, I think the answer is yes. Yeah. So last Friday night, I had the pleasure of going through a home here in Holiday on a beautiful acre-and-a-half lot, and met with the couple that owns the home and has lovingly taken care of it, and the lot and all of its landscaping. It's a 1930s and 50s home, completely intact inside, marvelously so. And their concern was that they would like that home to be preserved in perpetuity. And they worry that developers are anxious to have this property, and it's worth a lot of money, and they would, of course, remove that house. And so they want to know, what can I do to keep the house? Even when we're gone, I want that house to stay here. Well, one answer is preservation easement. That's essentially an agreement with a group like Preservation Utah to keep the house and to keep the condition of the house maintained. And there's a cost involved in that. There's some administrative cost. But it's actually something that you can get a tax deduction for. You can calculate by zoning and the size of the lot, the highest and best use and the income based on that, and compare it to the current use based on zoning, and that there's a differential, and you can take a percentage of that as a tax write-off. I had a project that it was a hotel that was restored and converted into single-room occupancies, or the single-room occupancy were doubled in size. They got a $600,000 tax write-off just for a facade easement, just for an agreement to keep the facades intact, because you're giving up a development right, and you can be paid for that. So, more questions? Yes.
So what would you tell someone like me who, we bought a Tudor that was built in the 1920s, and it is almost still exactly as it was when it was built, and we thought about putting it on some sort of historic registry, but like you said, it doesn't prevent it from being torn down in the future. They said because I think about 80% of the windows have been replaced, so they said you don't qualify for any tax credits. So basically for someone like us, what's the point of going through all the hassle and headache and paperwork and et cetera, of putting it on a registry if there's no benefit? We don't get a tax credit, and we would put it on if it would prevent it from being torn down in the future, because it's beautiful and it should be saved. All these homes should. Like one of the ones you showed that's still standing is slated to be torn down in the next couple months. I mean, it's sad and it changes the look, and I think devalues Holiday incredibly. So like someone like me who's like, well, you think about putting it on, but why should we? There's no benefit.
Well, you're thinking of tangible benefit in terms of dollars. And the person sitting next to you identified other values besides dollars.
Well, she just said it gives people history of the home.
Yeah.
And that, I'll tell you right now, that's not going to prevent 99% of people from tearing it down.
Right.
If on a large piece of property, the developer is going to come in and be like,
Right.
yeah, I don't care.
Yeah.
So,
Well, who told you that it wouldn't qualify for credits?
well, we bought it 2 years ago, and the people who owned it before us had a guy come and evaluate it to see if they could get it on the registry, and so they just told us, he said, you can, but you won't get credits because the windows are not.
I have some insight into this story because I was that guy.
Good thing I didn't criticize you directly.
What I said is it's too bad that they changed the windows, but that house, and I know the house we're talking about, is fully eligible.
Yeah, you can change the windows back to the way they were.
Well, it's going to be incredibly expensive, but yeah.
Well, if you get tax credits, it pays for that expense.
It just reminds me of that game telephone where something is sad and something else, you know.
Yeah.
So you can put it on the register again. I've never heard of that building not being eligible for register just because of this.
Well, they didn't say it's not eligible, they just said you wouldn't get tax credit because it's not in it.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. No.
I can give you the contact of the person. You really need to stop.
I designed the restoration of a historic bank, Bank of American Fork. And we sent the drawings in to the state, and he said it's fine. We sent them into Washington, which is the second and last review. And they had some issues with the windows. That's their, like, number one priority, windows. And so I went back there with the bank president. We spent an afternoon with the reviewers. And after negotiating for a while, we agreed to a couple of minor changes, maybe $20,000 worth of changes. They got a $500,000 tax credit. So, more questions? Yes, sir.
So we have a piece of property that had one of these small 1890s homes. And like many homes of that era, they had a huge garden, right?
Mm.
So you have a fairly large piece of property in a small home. If you wanted to develop that, there's room for development, and you could save the home, but the zoning sometimes is such that that home would be a vast underutilization of the size of the lot. How can that home be addressed? I mean, there could be a way of saving it, but the zoning seems to...
Well, one way to do it is the way the Castro House was dealt with. It was moved. And I've been involved in moving buildings in Park City, like the Miners Hospital, the big, giant 400-ton building. We moved it from up on the hill down into the city park and made a library out of it. We moved the Oddfellows Hall in Salt Lake across the street, turned it around and sat it down so they could build the courthouse. We've moved miners' cottages. We've moved all those buildings at Wheeler Farm. A lot of those were moved around. So moving, it's not cheap, but if you can find another lot, a smaller lot that's more appropriate to the size, scale, and zoning of that house, if that house is architecturally significant, let's say, you can pick it up and move it and then sell that lot, sell the lot and get the money from the higher use. That's one idea. Or you can just carve out a small part for the house and sell off the rest, but then you're going to be surrounded probably by a 4, 5, 6-story, apartment building that may put your house in a context that's not very livable, desirable.
Yeah, Alan, just follow up on that. Is there grant money, to help with the moving costs for that scenario?
Well, there has been grant money much more in the past than there is now for that kind of thing specifically. The CLG program has grant money for studies, historic buildings, surveys, and things like that. The National Trust has a consulting services grant for small projects. There used to be something called America's Treasures that had big amounts of money, but it's been put on hold right now. Yeah.
I'm on the city council, and
originally
on the city council in 1999. For 25 years almost, the city council has agonized about the Castro House.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there were a location like Wheeler Farm or some other location where it would actually be used and part of an ensemble of historic buildings. I was just wondering if there's an avenue.
There's a place like that, and that is, this is the place, Heritage Park, that used to be a state park. Now it's a private park across the street from the zoo. Most of the buildings there were either reconstructed from photos and documentation or moved from someplace in the state to that park. Originally, the idea of that park was that it was kind of a composite park, a village, Mormon village, with buildings from all over the territory from before the railroad, before 1869. But they've changed that since, and they have buildings all the way up to the age of your building, for example. And they have taken buildings and brought them there, houses and barns and flour mill, all kinds of buildings. I've been involved in a lot of them. So that's one place. A lagoon has some of that, but it's more cartoonish, and I wouldn't put it there. If you have a building that's on the National Register, if you move it, it's automatically taken off because the building to lot integrity is gone. But if you put the building in an appropriate location where that integrity can be restored, it goes back on. So the Miners Hospital in Park City was taken off the register. We moved it, restored it in the city park, improved it in many, many ways, and it was put back on the register. Kim?
Is there a Milo Andrus house that, did they move one from?
Yes, Crescent. It's a two-story wood frame halfway house built in 1856 for one of his wives. And we picked it up and moved it. And the Brigham Young Forest Farmhouse, we cut it in half, moved it to Pioneer Trails, stitched it back together. And yeah, so wood frame buildings are a lot easier to move than brick or stone buildings. Yes?
Could you, and maybe it'd actually be more for like a councilman or someone, but address in a little more detail, so the pushback on why there's not a policy that you can't demolish this for designated historic homes because people are afraid of property rights. But if the policy were implemented in a way where you don't just go through and force it on people, that people will voluntarily put their home on it, and then when they sold it, whoever was buying it would know this is non-demolishable. I mean, would that really be infringing on personal property rights to have some sort of policy like that? I mean, I think of England, for example, and they have policies where you can't tear down certain grade homes, certain, historically listed homes, and it's what made the country so amazing. And Holiday has so much history and significance. And if it were a voluntary thing to originally put it on, and then obviously if you were voluntarily buying it knowing you can't tear it down, how does that infringe on property rights?
Yeah. Any demolition policy that would be approved by the city council who's not at this point inherently in favor of such a policy would have to be very delicately crafted. And I can give you lots of examples of how policies have been modified to accommodate certain worldviews, let's say. So I think hypothetically you're right, but I've seen different kinds of demolition policies. There's a whole range, and I think it's a menu. You could select one that might work here better than the really, really strict ones. Trolley Square, I've been their architect for the last 8 years, and they want to build a big apartment complex across the street to the south in the parking lot. Well, there's a couple of historic houses there. There's 4. And so we had to go to landmarks. One of them was moved there, so we got permission to take that one out. One was structurally unsound and about to fall over. We got permission to take that one out. But the other 2, we couldn't get permission to destroy them. And they were contributory buildings, not highly significant, but they were in a district. And we tried to make the point that that whole block was full of those buildings. Now there's only these 2 left. It's like a row of teeth with only 2 teeth left. What kind of a mouth is that? Well, they wouldn't buy that, So we agreed to move the buildings. So one we're picking up and moving, and the other one is too fragile to move. So we're going to accurately document it, which we've already done, and then reconstruct it on 2 vacant lots just behind the property. We're only moving them a couple hundred feet, and we found somebody who wants to buy those 2 buildings, renovate them, rent them out on those properties, and so we solved it that way. So there are lots of solutions. And lots of stories, lots of success stories. Well, I don't know what time it is, but I bet you it's time. Yes?
I've just been sitting here thinking about Dan's initial question about historic districts, and just sort of like to propose a few that could be established. I mean, districts, not just thematic.
Yeah.
I think Kentucky Avenue has a really rich collection of houses that tells the story of the development of Holiday from a place of country villas up through the mid-century. I think the area east of the Cobble Club has an interesting story that could be built around the Moyle Farm, and then its subsequent development into a mid-century, basically area of suburbs. And then the last one, I think that the area where you live, Kim, on the corner of Walker Lane and Compwood Lane, has a really important story to tell. Important for Holiday, but also for the state, in terms of documenting again the country villas of Compwood and you know, where a lot of the identity of Compwood originated in the late 19th century. Those are just three in the mind as I sat here.
Holiday is unique in its layout. As I drove around a couple of times, I had a hard time making sense of the street patterns and, you know, and addresses and yet it's more playful, it's more interesting, it's whimsical. You know, you go down Arbor Lane or Wander Lane or some of these little narrow streets and they're tree lined and there's a pioneer house and there's a modern house and there's a, you know, bungalow, and it's very eclectic, and that's the nature. You know, it's having towns with strict grids. That's really kind of boring, and compared to this has much more visual interest. A lot of it's the landscape and the atypical layout of it. So, any other questions? Well, thank you for inviting me, and I think I maybe will give the full text of this to Kim so the last 4 or 5 pages can get in there. And there was some politicizing, you know, and some preservation advocacy, and you know, you're responsible for knowing how your tax dollars are spent. So other cities are spending it on preservation. So why don't you try to, you know, push for that too, and that kind of thing. So thank you very much. What was your first speaker about?
The creation of Holiday.
The creation of Holiday.
Modern city of Holiday.
Oh, modern Holiday. What's your next speaker about?
It's a panel, right, from the Historical Society.
Yeah. Oh, Alan, thank you so much. This is another area we
I didn't know. Yes.
we're so anxious of the city.
And it was the mayor's idea to do a speakers series, and here we are in his room, right in his living room, and thanks to Holly for making this available.
The mayor and the councilman came, and I think that's really important that we are together, and there's so much to visit in this polarization. It's great when we can at least understand each other, whether we agree or not. So.
Well, and our first speaker was Leanne Stillman.
Okay.
You probably know Leanne. Yeah.
Interesting.
So, but from the city.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks so much for taking an interest in our history and giving life to where we live. Thanks so much.